Gerard from the University College London, and he will be giving us a talk on migrating consequences of job loss in low-income countries, evidence from Ethiopia. The talk will be 45 minutes, and at the end, we shall have 15 minutes of Q&A. But during the talk, you can type your questions on the Q&A, and they will be taken up. At the end, you can ask your question. The microphone will be opened, and you can ask the question yourself. But before that, I give space to Gianmarco Leon to make a statement. Welcome, Gianmarco.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I will just take, I wanted to take 1 minute from François' seminar to cherish the memory of Elizabeth Betty Sadoulette, who unfortunately passed away almost exactly a month ago. Betty was an influential figure in the field, and in fact, she was among the speakers in the first season of VDEV. She's influenced many of us who are here in the organizing committee at VDEV. She was Karen's advisor, my own advisor. François here took her class in grad school. Giacomo knew her well. She graduated from the University of Geneva in '82 and joined Berkeley's Agricultural Economics department in '85. And since then, she's made a number of very important contributions across the fields of agricultural economics, microcredit, conditional cash transfer. She studied property rights and environmental sustainability. The scope of Betty's work is just unimaginable, and what I've been always amazed of is what Francois and I were commenting before, that she's despite her long career, she's been always up to date with the latest developments in the field. And in fact, one of her colleagues at ARE mentioned that since she retired from teaching, her publication record could have earned her tenure in any top departments. Her commitment to development policy was also incredibly important, and she leaves an enormous legacy in among all her students, friends, and people that she influenced. She's been always remembered like an amazing and very generous advisor. Um, so, well, yes, I just wanted to share the sad news with everyone, and cherish Betty's memory and share this with you guys. So, without further ado, I leave you with Francois.
Thanks a lot, Gianmarco. Going to Betty's office hours was always one of the most insightful moments you could have doing a PhD at Berkeley. Okay, let me share my slides to begin with. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So, first of all, this is joint work with Lukas, Hensel in Beijing, Girum, Abebe at the World Bank, and Stefano, Caria in Oxford. So the motivation for this project, we are about to finalize the first working paper version, is twofold. So the first one is that so we're interested in job loss for formal workers in low and lower middle income countries. So why are we interested in that? Well, we all know that productive formal jobs are relatively scarce in low income countries. And there is a growing literature that try to study why that's the case and try to think about barriers to the formation of productive matches. And the 3 quarters on this project have contributed to that literature. But although we study a lot the formation of these matches, we don't know much about what happened when these matches are actually destroyed. What are the consequences of losing these kind of jobs? And I highlight here a chapter that I've been writing with two co-authors, Giorno Naritomi and Gustavo Gonzaga, on this literature. And so we don't know whether workers are able to cope with the income shock and how they do that. And we don't know whether they can go back to the formal sector or to productive jobs relatively quickly. And we would argue that this evidence gap is particularly severe if you think about urban, blue-collar, formal jobs, the type of jobs that are promoted by many governments in low-income countries as part of their structural transformation policy. So these jobs were also the ones that were central to the growth of many high-income countries today. And why is that evidence gap particularly severe? Is that it's hard to actually create these new sector of the economy. So recruiting workers is often a major investment that is often sunk, and that investment implies moving workers often from rural areas to urban areas where these jobs are. Workers need to accept big change in working condition. Factory work is very different from traditional activities, living in the cities, etc. And a lot of these jobs are, a lot of these investment costs are going to be worker specific for these reasons. At the same time, often these jobs are in export-focused industries, and so they're going to be exposed to fluctuation in international demand and other external shock. And so in that context, there is a risk that temporary shocks faced by these firms might lead to layoff. And although this is maybe for temporary variation in demand, these layoffs might potentially drive away workers persistently. And then that kind of sunk investment would be lost. So one question that we're interested in is whether that's the case, whether these workers would stay away persistently from these key industries and locations where government try to create these new industries. And the second motivation is about the type of policies that countries put in place to help workers financially after job loss. So what we call job displacement insurance policies. And so in the chapter so it's a chapter in the Handbook of Social Protection in developing countries that we are writing. That handbook is edited by Rima Hanna and Ben Olken. So we document that there is a very sizable difference in the type of policies that a government provide at different income level. So if you look in high income countries, about 80% of those countries provide unemployment insurance to their workers who lose a formal job, and about the same figure is mandate firms to provide a severance pay to their workers. So government mandated severance pay and government provided unemployment insurance are the two main type of job displacement insurance provided around the world. But when you go down the income distribution, you basically see that unemployment insurance programs disappear. So in low-income countries, there's basically no country that provide unemployment insurance. But severance pay remain sizable. And so relatively speaking, severance pay is much more important in low-income countries than unemployment insurance. That said, unfortunately, if you look at the evidence that we have in economics, most papers that were published on the topic in top economic journal in the last 25 years, they focused on unemployment insurance program, not on other type of job displacement insurance policies. And most of those focus on the context of high-income countries. And when I write not high income on this graph, this is basically the type of countries that I've studied a lot in previous papers, like Brazil, which are upper middle income countries. So if you think about low income countries, we basically have no evidence, and you also have relatively less evidence on the type of policies that these countries implement. And so what we're trying to study in this paper is to try to shed light on the optimal design of job displacement insurance policies in low-income countries. So we're interested in two questions. The first one is, what are the welfare gains from providing more financial support to formal workers at job loss? The second one is, what are the welfare gains from providing financial support in the form of a lump sum transfer, which is what mandating a severance pay does. And the second question is not obvious. So I have a paper in the AER with Jean Arnaud where we argue that the insurance value that is provided by this lump sum transfer or one-off payment could be quite limited. So basically, I'm going to show you a graph in the next slide, but in Brazil, we see that there is a big spike in consumption spending right after workers are laid off in Brazil. And that's when they are eligible for a sizable severance pay, so a big lump sum at layoff. And then we also have some, actually I can just show you that directly. So that's the figure we have from that paper. So basically you can see that this is kind of a difference in difference where we compare workers who lose their formal job in month 0 to workers who remain continuously employed over the same period. And we have administrative data on expenditure or consumption spending in that paper. And so what you see here is that after job loss, while you would typically expect workers to reduce their consumption, at least for a short period of time, from about 3 months, consumption goes up, not down. So we see this big spike. And but they're also eligible for unemployment insurance in this context, but they exhausted by month 5. And so you can see around month 5, there is kind of an acceleration of the drop in expenditure. But this is not sharp. The reason that's not sharp is because we are centering the data around layoff, not around exhaustion of unemployment insurance here. And some people start collecting unemployment insurance a bit earlier, some a bit later. But if we show in the paper, if you recenter around your exhaustion, actually there's a sharp drop in expenditure. So workers receive a lot of money lump sum at job loss. They seem to be spending it relatively quickly to the point that 5 months later, when they run out of unemployment insurance, they are not able to smooth through that predicted loss in income. And so that suggests that there is high sensitivity of consumption to cash on hand. And then we conducted kind of qualitative surveys in that paper with about 200 workers who were basically in line to apply to receive their unemployment insurance. And we basically asked them hypothetically, would you like to receive your 5 months of unemployment insurance all at once immediately? And to their surprise, but consistent with this pattern here, more than half actually tell us that they don't want that. They actually like the fact that unemployment insurance benefits are paid in tranches because that can help them control their expenditure. So that suggests that the kind of pattern that we see in this figure could be driven by a form of a sophisticated present bias. And so we have in that paper, we've kind of we fit a simple structural model of job search and consumption with present bias. And when you do that, you can basically then show that there's a potentially large gain from moving away from one-off kind of severance pay towards payment that remain unconditional. So like severance pay, so it's not conditioning on whether or not you have a new formal job, which is a key aspect of an employment insurance program. But instead of giving a lump sum, you make payment in tranches, for example, every month. And so basically then, because it remains unconditional, you don't create any moral hazard, but because you make it in tranches, you kind of mechanically help worker better smooth the consumption. So we show in that paper that this kind of policy change would be potentially win-win, but in practice, no country does that. And so that's something that we're actually going to study experimentally in this paper. And then, so that was about the insurance value of one-off payment. Then we also know very little about the impact of these kind of policies on re-employment outcomes in low-income countries. So we don't know whether this kind of unconditional financial support speeds up or slows down re-employment when it's provided right after job loss. And particularly, we don't know whether that speeds up or slows down re-employment in these key industries and locations that government particularly care about. So that's in general. And if we don't have evidence in general, we also don't have evidence about the relative effect of the form of payment, one-off versus in tranches. There is a famous, here is a development audience, but in public economics, there is a well-known paper by Raschelli arguing that a lot of the kind of reduction in reemployment that is caused by unemployment insurance could be due to a liquidity effect, not to a substitution effect. So basically, just the fact that you provide resources to workers. To show that, and then he has this kind of nice theoretical paper showing that you can decompose the effect on the change in reemployment into a kind of substitution effect and a liquidity effect. And to do that, you need a kind of variation in liquidity in every month after job loss. He doesn't have that because that just never happened around the world. So then he used variation from a lump sum benefits from lump sum amount at job loss, and he argues, you can use that one to proxy for changing liquidity in every month after job loss, because essentially in a standard model they would have similar prediction on reemployment. And we're actually going to show you in this paper that that's not the case in our setting. Okay, so with this long introduction, what are we going to do in this specific project? So we're going to mainly study a randomized control trial with workers from who were displaced from a garment factory in Ethiopia. So we're going to have 3 treatment arms. We're going to have a control group that just received the statutory severance pay that firms are mandated to provide in Ethiopia. We're going to have a lump sum group, which also received the statutory severance pay, but on top of that, they receive an extra one-off payment from the research team. So that's kind of trying to mimic an increase in the severance pay that is already provided in Ethiopia. And then in the monthly treatment arm, we're going to essentially, instead of providing an additional one-off payment, we're going to provide an equivalent amount, but in 5 monthly payments. So that's for the experimental part of the paper. Now we also have some quasi-experimental variation to try to study the effect of job loss per se. So what we do there, we're gonna, so besides our sample of displaced workers, we're gonna have what we call a non-displaced sample, which is essentially a sample of workers from another garment factory nearby who were not laid off at the same time. Okay, so we're basically going to do a difference in difference, comparing workers who were from that other garment factory to displaced workers from our main sample. There are some slight differences between the 2 groups of workers. It's not a randomized controlled trial, so we're going to reweight the non-displaced sample so that it's balanced on a large set of outcomes. Respect to our non-displaced sample. And so that's the setting. But then in terms of data collection, we're going to track workers over 1 year post layoff, and we're going to have 7 rounds of data collection. We're going to have a baseline survey. We're going to have 5 phone surveys over the course of the following year. And in each survey, we ask retrospectively questions about the last 2 months. And then we have an end-line survey, and there again, we ask retrospectively about the last few months. So the goal is really to try to have a panel data at the monthly level for all the workers in our sample. So, to say a bit more about the setting, so the setting that we're going to study is the Hawassa Industrial Park. So actually, lots of papers that have been written already in this setting. So some of you may know, but basically in the last 10 years, these industrial parks have been central to Ethiopia's growth strategy. So in many ways, Ethiopia is aiming at becoming China's successor in light manufacturing, and they've been relatively successful at attracting foreign direct investment to these parks. So Hawassa Industrial Park is one of the earliest and one of the largest. So it had up to 35,000 workers at its peak. And most firms in the park are involved in garment manufacturing. The typical worker in these firms basically the typical worker you would expect to work in garment manufacturing in a low-income country. So they're going to be young, female. In Ethiopia, they have actually, most of them have secondary education. And consistent with the first slide, many of them are first-time migrants to the city. So this is going to be a very specific type of population, but we're going to argue that this is actually a very relevant population if you think about structural transformation policies. So if you look at other episodes of structural transformation for rich countries today, the kind of archetype of the factory girl, which has very much similar characteristics, was central in these episodes as well. And so a key policy challenge in this context, as I said before, is how to attract and retain these workers in manufacturing. And so that's something that that the park often struggle. And in fact, the context, like the reason we managed to pull off this project is because my co-authors were actually involved with a specific firm in the park to try to study how to incentivize workers to stay in the firm. So a big challenge in the park is that workers don't seem to necessarily adjust very well, and so quit rates are quite high, especially at low tenure levels. And so they had an experiment where they were designing bonuses for that would be paid if you stay long enough in the firm. Unfortunately, the firm, so my co-authors learned that the firm had to lay off most of their workers in September 2022. And so that previous experiment essentially had no reason to be anymore. The reason for this layoff is that Ethiopia lost its duty-free access to the US market because of the civil war that was taking place in the Tigray region at the same time. And the firm that they were partnering with experienced a large fall in orders from the US for that reason, and end up having to lay off about 2,000 workers. The key thing is that most other firms in the park exported to the Middle East or to Europe, so they were not directly affected by this kind of trade shock. And so if you look at the kind of aggregate employment in the park over the period, there's basically no evidence of any other major layoff at the same time. So, it's a mass layoff, but for the market itself is not a large aggregate shock. So let me maybe take 2 slides and then I can stop to see if everyone is on board. So the timeline, I've already said most of it, but you can see it here. So essentially in September, so at the end of August, early September, workers were made redundant. The partner firm paid their severance pay, their managed severance pay in September. In October, workers were in the lump sum group received the additional one-off payment from the research team. And then the workers in monthly group started receiving the monthly payment. Those lasted 5 months. And then after that, we did not provide any additional resources. And you can see in green below all the data collection rounds. And so in terms of contribution, I think there are 3 main areas where we contribute to. So first, we provide new evidence on the impact of job loss in low-income countries. So most of the evidence that exists outside high-income countries are from actually upper middle-income countries. And in terms of substance, what we're going to show is that in our context, one kind of self-insurance mechanism that workers rely on that wasn't that relevant in the context of Brazil, for example, which I studied, is informal transfers from workers' family and close network. Which for many of you, that's probably not a surprise, but in this specific context, we didn't have much evidence of that. Second, we provide experimental evidence on the impact of job displacement insurance payment. Even in high-income countries, actually quite rare to have an experiment where you can vary the financial resources that workers have at layoff. And in doing that, we participate to this growing literature on social protection in developing countries. So what's interesting for us is that in kind of the social assistance literature, there is this growing body of evidence arguing that there's not much evidence that cash transfer discourage work. So this kind of standard income effect may not quite apply. There's also work on the optimal structure of cash transfer when the goal is to raise people out of poverty. So I highlight a paper here. But we're going to argue in our paper, there's a key difference between the context of job loss and the context of social assistance. So we're going to basically show that income effect actually do matter when we're looking at cash on hand provided right around the time of job loss. And then we're going to show that the modality of payment, whether it's a lump sum or in tranches, matter for both consumption smoothing in light with the literature from the result from Brazil, but also reemployment in a way that it's maybe a bit more surprising. And then we're going to show also that workers are sophisticated about their demand for payment modalities. So again, consistent with the indirect evidence we had from Brazil. And then finally, we contribute to the literature on formal labor markets in low-income countries. So as I said, my quarters have contributed to the literature on the creation of these productive jobs. But there is also a literature that argue that the appeal of these factory jobs at early stage of industrialization is obvious, that some workers may actually not necessarily want this job or may not necessarily want to stay in these jobs. And so that's actually potentially relevant for us. So we're going to see that job loss leads to a persistent drop in formal manufacturing employment, and that these policies, the GDI policies, especially as they are provided in the form of lump sum, they actually further help workers move away from these key industries and locations. So especially among workers, we express a demand for this kind of payment. So there's a group of workers that seem to actually not necessarily want to stay in those jobs, and GDI policies help them move away persistently. So, with this long introduction, given that we started a little bit late, can I just check how much time I have?
There is one question from Natalie.
I'm happy to take a question, but can I just ask how much time?
20 minutes, yeah.
20
minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just...
Natalie is asking, are those in the sample typically migrating from other places within Ethiopia or internationally?
So it's all within Ethiopia. A lot of them come from rural area right around Nawasa.
Yeah. Garance, you want to wait until the end?
Yeah, in the interest of time,
yes.
If there is anything that is really needed for clarification, happy to take it. Otherwise, I'm just gonna make sure that I go through the result and then we can chat.
Excellent.
So yeah, I can get started on the analysis. So before starting to present the result, we did one of these online survey with economists to get at expectations in the profession. And so I'm just presenting here some overarching result from this. So first we ask economic about the expectation about the impact of job loss in our setting. So looks like economists expect the job loss to be a significant shock in this context. Then we ask about the experimental variation. So what was interesting for us is that the economist prior seems to have changed or have adjusted to evidence over the last few years. So economists tend to expect expenditure to be sensitive to cash on hand. So they expect, for example, that the lump sum group will spend more in the short run than the monthly group. But they don't expect any long-term effect from this different payment modality. They also, actually, most of the economists we survey are development economists, and so maybe consistent with the social assistant literature, they expect no income effect on reemployment. And then finally, they expect that the lump sum might actually encourage migration back, or migration in general. Okay, so what do we actually find? So I'm going to show you two sets of results. The first one, what are the impact of job loss, using a difference in difference, comparing the control group in our display sample to this non-display sample from this other garment manufacturer. And then I'm going to show you the experimental results on the impact of additional lump sum payment or monthly payments. And then I'm going to try to put this result together into some sort of welfare framework. So about the impacts of job loss. So no, here I'm just showing you, averages over time. If I compare just for the displaced control in black, the non-displaced sample in the dash gray, and then the job loss literature in high-income countries differ a little bit in what kind of counterfactual they consider. So basically, the solid line, the solid gray line, is we considered only workers in a non-displaced sample that stays continuously employed, which is, for example, the counterfactual that we had in our Brazil paper. The one that we prioritize in this paper is the dashed gray line, which is basically the entire non-displaced sample. And so in that sample, workers can separate from that job at any point after the baseline survey. We just, in the baseline survey is only done among workers with at least minimum tenure. So then prior to the baseline survey, everyone was employed in all these samples. So what you can see here, you can see there's a persistent gap in employment. So the displaced control, about 90% of them are still without wage employment in the, right after job loss. They kind of recover over the first kind of 8 months, but then they kind of peak. Their employment rate kind of peaks around 60%. So if you look at point estimates, the mean here is over the 14 months after job loss. Month 13 is the last month that we collect data for. So you can see there is a persistent drop in wage employment that is not compensated much by any increase in self-employment. And also you can see the effect on formal work or factory work is basically quite close to the effect on wage work, which suggests that informal wage employment is also not a main coping mechanism in our context. And actually, if you look at survey data for young women with secondary education, you can see that actually few of them work as self-employed or informal employee. One key point to highlight here is that actually these workers, not just that they are without a job, actually a lot of them are searching for a job. So, on average, there's an increase in 5 percentage points, but across all the months that we have, more than 80% of the sample report searching at least 1 month, and like more than 60% for at least 2 months. So it looks like some of that non-employment could be involuntary. So we also see a drop in total expenditure on the left, which is actually, I'm going to show you in the next slide, much smaller than a drop in earnings. And so part of the reason could be that we see on the right this increase in net informal transfer. So workers are able to mitigate some of the earning loss by an increase in transfers from their kin network. And that's what we show here. So you see the drop in labor income, the increase in net transfer income, and then we see a drop in total expenditure, which is about 10 to 20%, depending on the period you look at. And this drop in total expenditure is also there if you look at core expenditure, so like food and other necessities. And then, this change in average expenditure is not just driven by kind of people with relatively high expenditure to begin with. If you look at the bottom of the distribution, we actually see more than doubling of the extreme poverty in our sample. So people spending less or consuming less than the poverty line. So job loss seems to be a meaningful shock in this context. And then the last main result, there is this big increase in migration. So the outcome here is the share who are still in Hawassa. And so, very quickly, about 20% of the sample migrate away from Hawassa, and that peaks to about 30% by the end of the sample. So we see this 20 percentage point increase in migration, and a lot of it, you can see that in column 4, a lot of it is people migrating back home. So that's for the effect of job loss. Now, moving to the experimental variation. So I'm going to first show you short-run impact. So what I want to highlight here is that, so in column 1, we're showing you the treatment effect on total expenditure in month 01. So basically, right around the time that people receive a lump sum payment, if you're in the lump sum group. And so we can see that total expenditure increases sharply in the lump sum group, but not in the monthly group compared to the control group. Then if you just move a few months later, by months 2 to 5, the lump sum group is not spending more than the control group already by that time. But now the monthly group is spending more, and the difference between lump sum and monthly is very significant. So, you know, this pattern is very consistent with the prediction from our result from Brazil. So that's kind of what we were looking for. But then what's probably most surprising is that there's a wage effect, a wage employment effect. So the lump sum group start being much less likely to be employed. In the short run, this seems to be one-to-one compensated by an increase in self-employment. But that's only true for months 0 to 1. By months 2 to 5, self-employment went down, as if these businesses were basically unsuccessful. But the wage employment result worsened. So we were looking for the effect on total expenditure. We find it, but in fact, there's this effect on employment that is probably even more striking than the effect we were expecting. In migration, if you look at the overall lump sum versus the overall monthly, we see no difference, but I'm going to show you that actually there's a difference if you look at where people go. So one thing that because we expected this result on total expenditure, one thing that we did was to basically experimentally test the prediction of the paper we've shown in Brazil. So what we did at baseline, we elicited workers' preference for the type of treatment through a standard elicitation, like a multiple price list, essentially. And so what we do here, we're showing you in this row the treatment effect of lump sum versus monthly among workers who at baseline expressed a very strong preference for the monthly treatment, in the sense that they were willing to accept much less money in the form of monthly compared to in the form of lump sum. And so what's interesting then is that you can see that the spike, so we look at month 0 to 1, the spike in total expenditure is really driven by the workers who got the lump sum but really wanted the monthly, which is exactly what sophisticated temptation or prison bias would predict. So that's kind of that was the target. Now in practice, we have this effect on employment, and then what's interesting there is that your preference for treatment baseline is also very predictive of your exposed behavior in terms of job search and employment. So the one who really wanted the monthly, they actually are searching. They are actually searching more if they receive the lump sum than monthly, maybe because they run out of money quickly. But the one who wanted the lump sum actually are less likely to search, and they are the one who are responsible for the drop in wage employment. They are the one responsible for the increase in self-employment. They actually migrate out when they receive the lump sum, while the people who want the monthly are going the other direction. That's why the net effect on migration was 0. And most of the migration of the group who really wanted to receive a lump sum is to go back home. So that was for the short run. Now, if you look at long run impacts, so again, I'm showing you the mean over the 14 months, and then the last months we have data for. You can see that on average, the monthly increased total expenditure, but not the lump sum, and the difference is significant at 6%. In terms of labor income, you see again, this this is a bit less precise, but you see this reduction in labor income. But basically, the main point is in this table is that the wage employment that you saw by months 2 to 5 is basically still there by the last month in our data. The self-employment is basically short run. It's not compensating the drop in wage work. And then by the end of a period, so, you know, on average, there was no effect on migration because of these two counterbalancing effects among the people who strongly prefer the monthly versus not. But by end line, there's a big increase in migration away from our cell. And you know, and basically in the long run, it's also true that the effect on wage work is similar if you look at formal work, factory work, work in the park itself, or any other work using the type of skills that workers had acquired in their previous job. And to make sense of this finding, we also show some result on mechanism. So, you know, the effect on self-employment here, we're looking at any self-employment of the period, not just in a specific month. So, you know, the lump sum drives this, and it's entirely coming from workers who wanted the lump sum at baseline. We also look at the aspiration for working in a factory. At end line, we see a reduction from the lump sum driven by those workers who wanted the lump sum. They also, you know, maybe because they check out from that labor market, they are much less likely to have employed friends, and they are the one driving the migration result, and most of it come from migrating back home. Sorry for my voice. And then one last point here. Essentially, you can explain most of the employment effect if you just look at migration result, self-employment, and the effect on job search early in the job spell. And then the last piece of basically the last result we have. So these are exploratory in the sense that we didn't pre-specify them, but some of them are quite striking, so we still report them here. So what we show essentially is that if you look at the workers who did not have a strong preference for the monthly at baseline, essentially we have potentially a treatment effect of the lump sum on being married by the time we do the inline survey, which would be about 15 months after job loss, and even on the number of children. And they're also less likely to be involved in any training activity. So basically, it looks like there is a group of workers that wanted the lump sum and seem to have used the lump sum to essentially move away from this kind of new type of formal work, and essentially went back towards a more kind of traditional lifestyle for young women in Ethiopia. I can pause now and then wrap up. So I don't know if there is any question before I move to the welfare implications.
Rans, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So let me just finish by putting this result into a welfare framework. So I'm going to skip this, but basically, you know, we also ask a bunch of questions about life satisfaction and anxiety and things like that. We don't see clear pattern. So, you know, we have these very different result on wage employment, etc., but we don't have strong evidence that that people are making a mistake essentially by checking out from the labor market, at least from a private point of view. So we're going to take their preference at face value, and we're going to look at the welfare implication of that using a standard kind of public economics framework. So you can see at the bottom here, so we're going to compute the welfare effects from these policies. And the units here are normalized by what we call the mechanical cost. So think about the units here are basically per dollar of the transfer provided. Okay, so when you see if you see 10%, it would mean that it's equivalent to a 10% increase in the amount transfers to worker. So the welfare effect is going to have three components. The first one is the standard fiscal externality in public economics. So it's the effect on the government budget coming from behavioral responses. So in this context, if workers stay away from formal jobs for longer, then they are less likely to pay taxes. And so that's going to have a negative effect on the budget of the government. That's the first column in this table. Then we add a term that is not typical in public economics, but very relevant from in our setting, is a potential industrial policy objective. So if you stay away from manufacturing, from the manufacturing sector, then you potentially lost this worker-specific recruitment costs. And so we're gonna try to assign a value to this additional externality. So basically, think about like every gain to society above and beyond the wage that a worker receives. We don't know what that value is, so we're going to consider a range of values going from 6% of workers' wage that accrues to society. You know, that's we pick that number. You know, it's just equivalent to the tax rate. So tax rates are quite low in this context. And then we're going to look at 25% or 50%. And then the last term in the welfare computation is this kind of a standard measure of the value of insurance. So it's going to be the average marginal of substitution for money while employed versus after job loss. And so that I'm going to show you in the next slide. So, but basically here, if we start from the first two components, you can see, you know, because the lump sum payment reduce employment in formal jobs, it leads to a negative fiscal externality. It's not very big because these workers are relatively low income. They don't pay much taxes. The monthly payment leads to a smaller drop in employment. Therefore, the fiscal externality is smaller. And then the last kind of row that we have, we simulate what happened if workers had been allowed to choose their payment modality based on their elicited preference at baseline. And, you know, because some of them would choose the lump sum, then this number is between the lump sum and the monthly. So that's about the fiscal externality. Now, if you look at the industrial policy, you know, so this is basically a function of the kappa here, which is this kind of marginal external benefit of manufacturing employment that we are calibrating, times the treatment effect on manufacturing employment. So, you know, lump sum has the worst effect. Therefore, the industrial policy objective is the largest here in absolute value over a monthly payment, over choice of payment modality. And, you know, of course, you know, the point estimates are going to be very sensitive to the size of these external costs. Now, let's try to think about the insurance value itself. So if basically so here we have to think about what is the insurance value of providing more support in the form of lump sum, monthly, or if we allow workers to choose their payment modality. Within the context of our experiment, we don't know that. We don't have a way to measure this. The only measure we have is the relative preference for lump sum versus monthly. So there's basically a constant, which is the benefit from receiving more money in the form of a lump sum that we don't know. But we do know the relative benefit from receiving it in the form of monthly versus payment, or the relative benefit if workers were allowed to choose their payment modality compared to be forced to receive it as a lump sum. So that's what you see in column 3. So this capital C is an unknown at this stage, but then the other numbers come from our baseline elicitation. And so if you allow people to choose, for example, because there is a fair amount of heterogeneity in the sample, you can basically increase private welfare to an equivalent of like increasing by 10% the amounts provided. So it's a significant amount of heterogeneity here. If you basically, and it's slightly positive for the monthly payment because on average, workers slightly prefer the monthly payment in our setting. And so if you put things, yeah, sorry.
We bring it to a close now.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up. And so,
thank you.
And so if you put things together, you get column 4, and then with this constant there. So what we can do in column 4 is to basically subtract the result for the lump sum, and you can see the relative gain from providing the transfer in the form of monthly versus lump sum, or to allow for choice. You can basically see at low value of kappa, allowing for choice dominates because of these because a significant number of workers actually prefer the lump sum. But if the industrial policy objective is relatively high, this kappa is relatively high, then the monthly payment can start dominating because the monthly payment leads to lower decreases in manufacturing employment. And then at endline, we have an exercise where we try to elicit these capital C, essentially. We have another elicitation exercise where we try to estimate how much people would be willing to sacrifice today to receive more insurance in the future. And we find that this number is quite high. And so, you know, I'm going to skip this, but we find a very high margin of substitution that basically dwarf any of the other components. And so it looks like in our context, there is a very high demand for additional job displacement insurance policy. But the form through which you provide it matters a lot. So it looks like providing it as a lump sum payment, which is what every low-income countries does nowadays, is actually going against the objective of the government itself, because it's pushing away people from wage employment, and especially from manufacturing employment. So I'm just gonna conclude here, but you know, I'm around and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Gerard, for the presentation. We have a few minutes, and please remember Gerard is available after this. The link is on the chat. Please join. Garance, please go ahead.
Hi, François. Fascinating talk. So when you were talking about a bunch of the outcomes that you're looking at, like whether it is, you know, expenditure, whether it is even job participation or welfare, I was wondering how much we should be thinking about those girls as individual, or the relevant unit is the household, especially for like the migrant households. So how much do we think of, okay, you know, my eldest girl just got fired, and now it's my second that is going to go and look for a job, like and you know, and the first one comes back home and get married, or like.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So to be honest, I don't have much to say on this. So you know, maybe one thing that wasn't very clear is that essentially, so the initial project of my quarter had no reason to be once the firm had to lay off most of their workers, and so we basically learned, like in June 2022, that many of these workers were going to be laid off by the end of August. And so, you know, because they had the money for the initial experiments available, they asked authorization to the donors to basically transform it into a you know, a job displacement insurance experiment that we had to kind of design in a rush. So I think I'm very happy how it turned out for research point of view, but there are a bunch of things that we didn't have, we couldn't plan, and so we don't have extensive surveys of household, for example. The point that is important though is that at baseline, very few of these women are married. That doesn't mean that, you know, that doesn't rule out the story that you mentioned, of course. And then another thing, that because of the specific context where government, where there is both kind of where there is significant cost to attract and retain workers in this park, even if the story that you describe happens, I think, you know, these investments are still being sunk. You have to basically pay them again. Like these new workers would have to adjust potentially to living in the park. You would have to attract them, etc. You would have to train them. So one thing that is, you know, that is quite salient is that most of the job search is still for manufacturing employment. Most of the re-employment is still in manufacturing employment. But, you know, essentially lots of these workers that don't come back, they stop using the skills that they learn in the park.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris, would you like to ask your question? Okay, he was asking whether, thank you for a nice presentation. you find that monthly payments smooth consumption better than lump sum payments. Could the difference be explained by pressure from family/social networks consuming the lump sum?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I think we have a graph somewhere. So basically, after we elicit workers' preference for the type of treatment arm at baseline, we ask them why. Like, if you tell us that you prefer the monthly, we ask you why that's the case. So that's the red that you see here. So the group that I showed you is the darkest red. So if you have a strong preference for the monthly, basically like more than 80% tell us that's to control the expenditure. But, the story that you have is basically 10%, So 10% report that they're afraid that they might have to share with their kin network, essentially. And so, that could be very relevant. At the end of the day, what we find is that the net transfer they receive from others still goes up on average. But if you zoom very carefully, it's the fact that in the lump sum group, for example, there's in months 0 to 1, there is an increase in the transfer that you send back home. So some of that could be happening for sure, but that's to the extent that that's also preventing you from smoothing consumption. This could be an additional gain from providing this monthly payment. So we were like, we discussed that at length. I mean, I'm sure we're going to do it in this paper as well, but in the 2021 paper that I described, we discussed that, but in Brazil, we didn't have much evidence that this was relevant. So that's why we modeled a sophisticated present bias worker.
Thank you. I know we could go on and on. It's an interesting subject, but unfortunately, our time is up. But remember, there is a Zoom room where you can get in and have further discussions. Thank you very much for the presentation, Gerard. We are happy. The next seminar is going to be on the 2nd of December, when we will have a Frank. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thanks, François. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.